Master Skywalker, there are too many of them. What are we going to do?
Apologies for scaring you there. I've misplaced my laser pointer, so I'm forced to use my lightsaber as an alternative. This is something of a breach of academic conduct, so I'm rather annoyed at myself. But I hope you can find it within yourselves to forgive me. Regardless, the answer to your question is, of course, to learn. Knowledge is power, and through self-improvement and personal cultivation, you can reach your perfected self. In aid of that, I prepared a short lecture on the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. Originally, the way the tragedy was introduced is through asking the other person if they've ever heard it. These days, however, it's only those who are very traditional, those who have a very rudimentary grasp of the tale, or those who are a bit dim who introduce it like that, because, frankly, everyone has at least heard of it. Ironic, I suppose, that the very opening of the tale has become so ubiquitous as to render itself functionally dead. The very life of the tale is what killed some of it. Quite the dichotomy. Of course, it's this galaxy-wide knowledge and appreciation that led to a number of different schools of thought emerging to analyze the tragedy, widely acknowledged to be perhaps the greatest short story ever penned. Naturally, it would be very time-consuming to list every school of thought. Indeed, were I to do so, it would likely take up the entire day. To quote an old joke, if you took 10 scholars of the tragedy and put them in a room to argue it out, you could rest assured that you would end up with 15 different views by the end of the day. Well, that often gets a laugh in academic circles. It's also particularly amusing in its original Hattis, as there's more wordplay. Traditionally, there are 5 schools of thought as respects the tragedy, though more recently, one of these schools has split, making 6, and of course, there is my own school of thought to consider. Together, these schools represent, appropriately, 66% of all interpretations. These schools are as follows: the paradoxical or tautological school, the thanatonic or inevitability of death school, the treacherous, betrayal, or, in its less extreme readings, the chicanery school, the cowardly school, the folly school, the gestalt school, the Skywalker, or dichotomous school. The purpose of this session is to give you a basic understanding of each major school and ensure you have some grounding in the analysis of the tragedy. It should be noted that, given our time is short, and I must be brief, I will not be able to delve into the nuances. Instead, I'll go through each of the aforementioned schools briefly, touching upon their interpretation and mentioning some of the foremost scholars. Bear in mind that the groupings are broad, and there are many scholars who have viewpoints spanning these schools or who adhere to the broad theme of their school while differing in the details. To quote the Jedi's very own Jocasta Nu, when she was performing an analysis of the schools, "The distinctions are clear at a distance, yet blurry close-up." Or perhaps she is merely long-sighted. Yes, probably best to hold in your laughter. As I mentioned, we are short on time. To dive in, let us start with the largest and most influential school, the paradoxical school. This school argues the tale is a work focusing on the repetitious nature of our lives, most famously articulated in Master Kenobi's work, The Tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise, Irony and Paradoxes. As a quick aside, I know paradoxes isn't a real word, but Master Kenobi is very insistent on not using the term paradoxes. He actually spent 3 pages arguing that paradoxes is far superior a word for the plural of paradox than paradoxes. He very much likes to argue the point, and it's honestly quite exhausting, so I don't recommend bringing it up to him. Either way, Kenobi writes, Plagueis famously uses the Force to influence the midichlorians to create life. Yet midichlorians are what allow for the use of the Force, and midichlorians themselves are required for life. Plagueis was, therefore, using midichlorians to influence midichlorians to create midichlorians. Perhaps he was wise, but he was also quite the tautologist. That gets me every time. As before, you'll forgive me if I don't stop for your laughter. We have a great deal of material to get through. Nonetheless, Master Kenobi's work is well known for its biting, and oftentimes humorous critique of the finer points of the tale, and was until relatively recently regarded as the seminal work of the paradoxical school, and Kenobi himself the foremost scholar within the field. Of course, those who have read my work will doubtless be aware that I was able to highlight a number of flaws in Master Kenobi's work, but nonetheless, I strongly recommend reading him, both on the tale itself and more broadly, his other works. I'm told his latest piece, The High Ground, Moral and Physical, is quite the page-turner. However, to return to our topic, Master Kenobi argues within his work that the tragedy is, in fact, a metaphor for the repetition inherent within our day-to-day lives. Just as Plagueis used the midichlorians to influence midichlorians to create midichlorians, so do we wake up, work, eat, sleep, and repeat in an endless cycle. To Kenobi, the titular tragedy is the tragedy of all sapient beings, namely that we are gifted with the most important gift of all, life. But we are forced to waste so much of it repeating ourselves over and over. And it is the absence of new experiences that hastens our inevitable end. After all, who here remembers clearly waking, getting out of bed, showering, and coming to their workplace? All those precious moments we can never have again discarded by our minds, time slipping through our fingers. Quite tragic, really. Next up is the inevitability of death, or the thanatonic school, which, to no one's surprise, I'm sure, argues that the story is actually about the fact death is inevitable, ever closing in on us, like a pride of softpod Nexu. To quote Jedi Master Ki-Adi-Mundi, the eternal sleep will come for us all, whether by fire, disembowelment, or pure and simple torture, none can escape its cold grasp. To this school, Plagueis is all of us. And at least in Master Mundi's interpretation, his power to keep the ones he cared about from dying was actually the ability we all have to stave off the infamous second death. This is, naturally, the notion that we all die twice. The first time is our actual death. The second time is the last time anyone ever remembers us, before we fade into eternal nothingness. The irony, for Mundi, is that, though the death of Plagueis ensures the final deaths of those he cared about, he himself has been bought a reprieve by the proliferation of the tale throughout the galaxy. Ironic indeed. As a quick aside, an interesting interpretation I read within this school by the scholar Ithiel Solaris positioned Plagueis not as a shadowy lord of the Sith, but rather as an academic, supplanted by his pupil. After all, he taught him everything he knew, as academics teach their students, who then go on to metaphorically kill their teachers through proving their old theories incorrect, perhaps refining their models or similar. It speaks to the old adage, academia advances one funeral at a time. This is perhaps my favorite interpretation within this school. The treacherous school is, in fact, a splinter from the paradoxical school. The reason for the split is most interesting and could itself very easily be a lecture, though we don't have time to get into that now. For the purpose of this talk, the key thing to note is that those within this school highlight the treacherous nature of the Sith, and for the more cynical, the inherent selfishness present within virtually all beings, manifesting itself as the overriding need to survive and thrive. Now, this may sound reasonable to you, but the scholar Telutho Kaldrak highlights the potential dark turn this can take. They write, put a looming calamity in front of a being, and they may work to avoid it. Put that same looming calamity in front of a group of beings, and tell them they could avoid it, and perhaps they shall. Put a looming calamity in front of a society of beings and tell them they could avoid it, but add the caveat that it'll cause disproportionate pain and you will have torn that society apart. They were, I think you'll agree, highlighting that beings will fight ferociously to maintain their own standard of living, even if doing so will doom others. To highlight another section from their work, for it is the urge to not merely survive, but to thrive in placing this concern above the lives of countless others that is the very view the tragedy is critiquing so powerfully. A very cynical viewpoint, and one I personally have my doubts about, but a highly influential voice within this field. Nonetheless, Their argument later in the piece is most intriguing. The apprentice of Plagueis is unnamed because the apprentice is you. The apprentice is me, and the apprentice is any being. The apprentice is the selfish urge that whispers for us to stab our coworker in the back for more credits. That tells us to spread rumors about another to reduce their standing and maybe increase our own. The apprentice is all of us who, once we have no further use for a person, a relationship, a position, we discard it or them violently and completely. Next is the cowardly school, most famously espoused by the late Master Windu, who tragically died of suicide for reasons which just go to show how important mental health and personal study are. Indeed, it's in his name that I'm delivering this humble lecture. Doubtless, he'd be thrilled. Now, Master Windu's most well-known work on the tale were the famous lectures he gave very publicly, which may lead everyone here to question why I even need talk about it. The answer is that I've recently met someone, and this is hard to believe, I know, who not only hadn't heard Master Windu's work, but hadn't even heard of the schools of thought on the tale. I won't name any names, but I don't want anyone to think this person an uneducated rube who'd be of more value recycled into protein chunks than to continue in his breathtaking ignorance. Happily, I was able to recite my full thesis a couple of times, and this error has been corrected. Suffice to say, in the unthinkable possibility you've never heard Master Windu's interpretation, he argues the tale is in fact a commentary on the cowardly nature of the Sith and the inherent failure of their order. He points to the failure of Darth Bane, Darth Zana, Darth Cognis, and so on to not only keep their rule of two secret, but to continually kill each other not in single combat, but rather through subterfuge or other underhanded means. What, Master Windu asks, is the point of setting up a system wherein you're expected to overcome your master through sheer power, when every gravid, green, and tenebrous will simply ignore your, and I quote Master Windu here directly, dumb as rule. He argues, quite forcefully, the Sith are complete and total fug-ups who manage to be physically revolting and morally pathetic. Insisting their power is what gives them the right to oppress others, only to backstab any threat they face like the slimiest woofaworms, all while insisting their cowardice is actually intelligence. Next, the folly school, famously a school of two halves. Indeed, some scholars within this school have argued that they should, in fact, be split. But this is an item of some contention, and the debate rages on. For myself, I believe the two are so entirely distinct as to be well deserving of becoming two separate schools. But alas, despite their clear differences, which will be articulated shortly, they remain, at present, united. The two halves are, of course, the Hutt view and the non-Hutt view, though we should note that many scholars who argue for the Hutt view are not themselves Hutts, and vice versa. Now, broadly speaking, the folly school covers the notion that Plagueis, frankly, was a fool who missed out on the ability to utilize his unprecedented gift to ensure personal wealth, power, and prestige. After all, would not eternal life be the greatest, most profitable gift of all? However, Plagueis failed to utilize his astonishing power and instead ended up dead himself. His gift not only failed to give him riches, but failed to preserve that greatest rich of all, his own life. The Hutt thinker, Locke, who, as is traditional for Hutts in academia, enjoys switching specialty every few decades, was the one who provides perhaps the most well-known non-Hutt interpretation of the folly school. To quote the being himself, Plagueis was, fundamentally, a man who repeatedly and continually threw away his potential. He could save others from death, yet we learn of none who this supposed could was actualized for. He taught his apprentice everything he knew, and thus rendered himself vulnerable. And in the end, he was killed in his sleep without even lifting a finger to defend himself. Every action in the tale from beginning to end is mistake after mistake. He makes himself redundant while leaving himself mortal. Put simply, had he the material, real-world power, his preservation, and thusly his implied quest to accumulate knowledge of the Force would have been assured. He didn't, couldn't, and thus became isn't. The Hutt view, meanwhile, uses the Hutt spirit of kajidich, which is a word that essentially translates to someone's gotta have it. Why not us? Now, here we need to speak carefully, as this term is regarded by some Hutts to be fundamentally speciesist, with some arguing that it relates specifically to Hutt gangsters and criminal organizations rather than Hutts within academia, and the use of it continues the stereotype that all Hutts are, at their core, criminals, violent or otherwise dangerous. Equally, there are those who seek to reclaim the word and use it as a celebration of Hutt culture, arguing that only through using it in a context outside the criminal can both the word and the Hutts broadly no longer be always seen in a negative light. This is, naturally, a mere aside, though very interesting. And we should note Hutt scholars have written to argue for other schools of thought as well. In fact, Locke famously has argued for and against every major school within the context of the tragedy. I myself was thrilled when Locke argued for and against my own school relatively recently. It was a personal milestone. Scholars argue that the spirit of Kajidich is fundamentally lacking in the tale, with the absence argued to itself be the tragedy spoken of within the title, to quote the scholar Beldorian. Plagueis was fundamentally unable to grasp the absurd power and wealth at his fingertips. He had, but he did not truly possess. And because of that, others were the ones to take his life and possess his power instead. Proponents of this view typically argue the apprentice is, in fact, the spirit of Khajiit punishing Plagueis for his consummate failure. Interestingly, in Hutt space, many Huttlets are told the tale as a warning of what will happen to them if they fail to grow up with the appropriate sense of Kajidich, perhaps an interesting cultural example of Hutt society utilizing their own innate tendency toward paranoia as a social propagation. The penultimate school I'd like to cover today is the Gestalt school, which deals with what some in that school pejoratively call isolated minds, but more properly are silo minds. It is this group which find this school hardest to grapple with. I don't see any beings who are hive minds amongst us, though some have argued all those attuned to the Force are themselves within a hive mind of a certain kind, so perhaps for us, it'll be easier to understand than for most. Nonetheless, those in this school argue the tale is a fundamental communication of what hive minds term maplos, the sense of isolation or fundamental loneliness silo minds experience. To briefly explain, a fundamental problem that silo mind philosophy discusses, but hive mind philosophy doesn't, is that of the problem of other minds, the issue that we can never truly be sure other minds exist, as the only ones we experience are our own. Hive minds, on the other hand, are able to sense the fact that other minds exist, and they can freely commune with them. This problem, therefore, is not one that truly exists in their own societies, though there are vague equivalents depending on the exact type of hive mind. For example, if the beings are merely telepathically linked but are otherwise independent, or if they're like Bilar, whose minds pool as more and more gather. As a quick aside, legends tell of societies with natural telepaths such as the Iktachi who likewise lack this problem. However, scholars have been unable to confirm whether these natural telepaths, outside the use of the Force, even exist. And naturally, once hive minds met silo minds, they learned the concept. But we are speaking to their tradition. Either way, maplos is the term hive minds ascribe to the silo minds' inability to determine whether others truly exist as independent, fully formed beings, or as essentially automatons. Isolated minds sprang from this view, with the notion being that silo minds are fundamentally deeply alone and will always and forever be isolated. Certain hive minds use the would-be aphorism, "We all die alone," as evidence of maplos. The phrase is, of course, common amongst silo mind peoples, but wholly alien to a hive mind. Scholars in this school, most famously the controversial collective Dilthric, argue the tragedy is the tragedy of all silo minds. I should note he uses the less favorable term for silo minds, but in the interest of decorum, I shall refrain. Time and again, he and himself are used, like pitiful gasps from a collective which has suffered a catastrophic loss of drones. The pathetic cries for help are all the more desperate the further we read into the tale, for the true tragedy is the inability of silo minds to even fathom the absence, in their experience, the tale exemplifies. For Dilthric, then, Plagueis is the average silo mind, isolated and alone. The tale is, as they read it, a scathing satire by a brilliant hive mind lampooning silo minds. The final school is, naturally, a personal favorite. The Skywalkerian school, also now famously known as the dichotomous school. Allegedly, this term sprung out of my apparent favor for the word dichotomy within the context of my thesis. This isn't something I agree with per se, but I think when your work reaches a level of renown such that it receives a nickname you haven't devised, that is itself a mark of affection. Now, my school of thought focuses on the meta-narrative, which, prior to my thesis, was an area which was fundamentally unexplored within the broader literature of the tale. My thesis, simply put, argued the tragedy was intended to lure the listener to the dark side of the Force, likely as a puzzle piece in a much grander strategy to do so. The lines of evidence for my viewpoint are multifaceted and complex, with my thesis, more appropriately, fleshing it out and requiring approximately 2 hours to do so, with an additional half an hour to discuss the interesting side tangent. However, I will offer a necessarily simplified view here, and when you have listened and doubtless want more, you can go on the Holonet to purchase a copy of my thesis. To continue, the tale is often introduced with the question, did you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise? With the expectation the listener will answer in the negative. Yet, prior to the publication of my thesis, no one had ever truly asked why this was. My interpretation was, given we knew the tragedy was a tightly penned story with not a word wasted, the answer was in the text. Darth Plagueis was a Sith Lord, and therefore beholden to the rule of two. He was murdered by his apprentice, who would therefore become the master. The question naturally arises. How would this figure then get their own apprentice? The answer was simple. The Jedi. It's not a story the Jedi would tell you, because the listener would themselves be a Jedi, have a loved one they wanted to save from death, but be unable to act, because the Jedi would not approve of their having a loved one they wanted to save. The tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise hints at the possibility of saving one's loved ones from certain death. The apprentice of the tale learned everything Plagueis knew, after all. Therefore, in telling the tale, the apprentice was dangling the prospect of the listener joining the dark side. The apprentice need only bait the hook, perhaps through threatening the loved ones of the listener, whether that be in the form of physical threats, or even through more esoteric means such as through the use of influencing premonitions or threatening the academic career of the loved one. Thus does everything fall neatly into place. The richness of the subtextual narrative, when viewed through such a lens, is something to behold. Indeed, the very start of the traditional reading, "Did you ever hear?" inherently invites audience participation, and the use of the language "killed him in his sleep," rather than murdered or assassinated, paired with the term ironic with the recounting of Plagueis' ability to save others from death, but not himself, suggests a wry amusement as respects the latter, and a distancing of the act for the former. If the apprentice were the one speaking, both would make sense. A quiet, sadistic joy in their act of murder paired with a desire for the listener not to view them in as harsh a light through the careful control displayed in the use of the language. This view would naturally make the tragedy a mythologized recounting of real-world events from the apprentice's life. Naturally, this raises further questions. But, alas, we do not have all day, and therefore, I shall close out my talk. For those who are curious about this or indeed would like a more in-depth exploration of the schools discussed here, then you really should purchase my thesis, or else seek out the talk once I upload it. Either way, thank you all for listening. Are there any questions? Oh, the younglings all killed themselves.